Okay, another video talking about ICOC, ICC and RCW. One of the first questions people ask is, are they cults or are they churches? How can you tell? Well, there's lots of ways you can tell. I find culteducation.com quite a useful website. It gives you 10 things to look out for that would be signs of a cult. Freedomofmind.com as well gives you signs of how a cult operates compared to a church. But let's think about some of the basics, all right? So the First Principles Bible studies, or so-called Bible studies, what do they produce? Well, Kip McKean and Chuck Lucas created these so-called Bible studies in the 70s, and it came out of the shepherding movement, also the discipling movement that became the Boston movement that became International Churches of Christ. So how many people are there, in these cults? With ICOC, it's just over 100,000. With ICC, it was around 10,000 until the split. And with RCW, it's about 2,000, something like that. So probably you've never heard of them. You've probably never heard of International Church of Christ, International Christian Church, Restored Church Worldwide, or Kip McKean, or Jason Dimitri, or Raul Marino. Probably you've never heard of these people, but it becomes important if you've lost somebody to one of these groups. Now the question is, as I asked, is it a cult? Is it a church? Well, in a normal, healthy church, they have fellowship with Christians from other denominations. So if you're a Christian, one weekend you might go down a Baptist church, but you'd be very welcome at a evangelical church, you'd be welcome at the Catholic Church or Church of England, and you would be welcomed as a saved person. And this is very important. You would be welcomed to, most normal healthy churches. If you say you're a Christian, they'll take you at your word. Who are they to judge you? But with the Kip McKean groups, they insist that people go through First Principles. Now, in the ICOC, they've watered it down a little bit. But First Principles basically teaches that the only way you can find God, seek and find God, is through them. So if you're a Baptist, you wouldn't be considered saved. If you're a Catholic, you wouldn't be considered saved, or Church of England, stuff like that. So initially, a cult can be considered very judgmental. And because they are judgmental, other groups, other churches would consider a cult because they don't consider, they judge whether somebody is saved or lost. More intense in International Christian Church and RCW. But even with the ICOC, if you are just a Baptist, evangelical, Pentecostal, whatever, they'll sort of look at you and they'll judge you, as to be lost. So why do they do that? Well, it all comes down to this First Principles. And on this channel, we're going to go through each of these so-called Bible studies, pick it apart, prove why they are false doctrine, and prove why they create a cultic environment, right? So, because a cult, whether it's Mormons, Jehovah's Witness, whatever, because they teach unique salvation doctrine only through their group, That's one of the reasons they're called a cult. A cult as in a group of people, that don't accept others as saved, But it goes deeper than that. They don't have fellowship with other churches, and there's so many other things they do that will. Another sign of a cult is the leaders decide whether a member is worthy of getting married or not. In a normal healthy church, you and your girlfriend decide whether you want to get married or not. In a cult, they decide who marries who. And it's usually based upon recruitment, paying an old covenant tithe, which Jesus and the apostles never taught disciples to give a 10% tithe, And a lot of these groups that talk about tithing, what they tend to forget is if you think you can be saved by the old covenant law, then the Bible actually says you are under a curse. You're under a curse if you're trying to be saved by the old covenant law. So Christians do not need to follow the Ten Commandments. Christians don't need to go to church on a Sabbath. The New Testament standard is they met every day. The believers met every day. It's very different, New Covenant from Old Covenant. Jesus said, all you have to do is love God, love one another, and you have fulfilled all the commandments. So when you have a cult that is pretending to be a church and it tells you to give an Old Covenant tithe, absolutely, that is false doctrine. You give what you decide to give. In Corinthians, it talks about the goal is equality. So not rich leaders on 6 or 7 figure salaries flying around the world living in luxury, all paid for by unemployed people, single mums, single parents, or students or low paid workers. The goal is equality. So if you go to a church that is actually a cult pretending to be a church and you see leaders living in luxury, traveling around the world, all their expenses paid for, it is a cult. The Bible in Corinthians, again, 2 Corinthians 9, says, you give what you want to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion. But my first-hand experience of ICOC and ICC is if you don't give them money, then they don't consider you a member, they don't consider you saved, and it's very legalistic. Church attendance, is a decision whether you're saved or lost, whether you go to their church or not. So a healthy church doesn't decide who marries who. They might give you advice, but it's not mandatory advice, and they would have no issue in a healthy church with you visiting other churches. So as I said, I think we've pretty much covered some of the basic signs of a cult. Most sort of cult websites will say there's a charismatic leader that is authoritarian or totalistic, you could say that. I guess that could be one of the signs, but the signs mostly are what they teach and what they believe, and therefore how they behave, and especially how they behave to other people outside of their particular denomination. So there you go. I hope that's useful for somebody, but I would consider them cults pretending to be churches. Now the Bible teaches very clearly in Ephesians 2 that you are saved by grace, not works. You have to separate the two things. What Jesus did on the cross saves you, not what you do. What you do is your personal response, not dictated to by dictators behind the pulpit. What you do for Jesus, you do for God, you do for people. That's up to you. Yeah. Anyone who starts telling you what to do is a cult leader. Yeah. They can give you advice. They can say this is a good idea, but you have to separate your salvation from your deeds or your works, because salvation is a gift. You can't earn it by church attendance, doing what the leaders say, or any of that nonsense. Yeah. So even the Bible gives an example of a cult leader in 3 John verse 9 and 10. Diotrephes loves to be first. Narcissistic characteristics. All you got to do is Google or ask AI what a narcissist is. Puts people out of the church, a control freak, doesn't welcome other believers. Yeah, all the signs of a cult. Yeah. So we'll take it from the top. A cult teaches that their group is the only way to God. Yeah, that's what they teach. That's what they imply, and they will use manipulation. They'll say things like, well, if you love God, you'll give to God's movement. You decide what you give. And just because maybe you can't give as much as the next person doesn't mean you don't love God. So a cult is judgmental. They tend to be hypocritical. And Jesus has very strong things to say about them in Matthew 7. Many will say to him, Lord, Lord, didn't we do all these deeds and works? And he says to them, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Yeah. If you read the New Testament, you will conclude, naturally, without me telling you anything, that you're saved by grace, not works. It's good to do good works, but you're not saved by those good works. So hopefully that's useful to somebody. So where they insist that you go to their church only, that's a cult. Where they teach what no other church teaches, that's a cult. They have no fellowship with other believers from other churches, that's a cult. And what else is there? I think that's enough. I think I've covered the bases. So there you go. Let me know what you think in the comments.